Your Excellency, dear students, dear colleagues, friends and guests, please join me in welcoming His Eminence Kardinal Kurt Koch, the President of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity in Rome. We can say that he has during his whole life been at the heart of the ecumenical dialogue. Born in Switzerland, where he later served the Church as Bishop of Basel, he lived in a climate that is deeply formed by ecumenical difficulties and opportunities between the churches of the Reformation and the Catholic Church. As a widely renowned and recognized theologian, he is the author of a series of books on ecumenical theology and the Church. We are grateful that Kardinal Koch has come here to lecture for us today on the topic developments in ecumenism since Vatican II. After the lecture of the Cardinal, which will approximately last for 1 hour, we will have a brief coffee break, which will be served in what we call Rådet, right down that direction. And afterwards we can regather here, and there will be the opportunity for questions and for discussions. But first of all, welcome Your Eminence Kardinal Koch.
Your Excellency, dear Father Rector, dear ladies and gentlemen. Half a century ago, the Second Vatican Council, which represents the Magna Carta of the Catholic Church even in the 21st century, was opened. Looking back, over the past 50 years since the opening of the Council also means looking back over 50 years of ecumenical engagement by the Catholic Church. Ecumenism was not just one issue among many at the Council, but one of its essential motivations. In calling the Council, the Blessed Pope John XXIII combined two major concerns which in his view were intimately connected, namely the renewal of the Catholic Church and the restoration of the unity of all Christians. These goals were both fully affirmed by Pope Paul VI when he declared in his opening address at the second sitting period of the Council that ecumenical rapprochement between Christians is one of his essential goals, the spiritual drama for whose sake the Council had in fact been summoned. And at the promulgation of the decree on ecumenism, he established a fundamental nexus between this decree and the dogmatic constitution of the Church, in the sense that the ecumenical decree explicates and completes the dogmatic constitution of the Church. Pope Paul VI clearly gave inescapable expression to the fact that ecumenism is not simply a supplement or appendix to the life of the Catholic Church, but pertains to the essential nature of the Church and its mission within history. In this sense, the decree of ecumenism established that one of the major tasks of the sacred ecumenical Second Vatican Council is the endeavor to assist in restoring the unity of all Christians. That Christian ecumenism is not simply task becomes immediately evident at first glance at the 2000-year history of Christendom, where one finds any number of divisions and splits. But the ecumenism decree, in the introduction to the 3rd chapter, which presents the churches and ecclesial communities in East and West, separated from the Holy See in Rome, and discusses means of reconciling them in unity, states that it intends to examine more closely two special categories of schism, by which the seamless robe of Christ has been torn asunder. Its starting point is the two fundamentally different types of schism, namely, on the one hand, the great schism of the 11th century, between the Eastern and the Western Church, or more precisely, between Rome and the Eastern Patriarchates, and on the other hand, the great split within the Western Church in the 16th century, which was followed by a trail of further splits. It is self-evident that each of these two fundamentally different schisms demands to be dealt with historically and theologically in separate ecumenical dialogues. Therefore, the Pontifical Council for the Promotion of Christian Unity, which Pope John XXIII established already 2 years before the beginning of the Council, was divided in 2 sections, East and West. It therefore seems logical to reflect on the 2 sections separately in order to gain an overview of the various ecumenical dialogues, more precisely, what issues are to be dealt with, how far ecumenical understanding was advanced in the meantime, and what problems still remain. Before the schism between East and West in the 11th century, the first great divisions in the history of Christendom occurred in the Orient already in the 4th and 5th centuries, when individual ecclesial communities did not accept the doctrinal decision of the councils of Ephesus and above all of Chalcedon in 451, and therefore separated from the imperial church. A distinction is therefore drawn between the Chalcedonic and the non-Chalcedonic churches, which are today designated as the Oriental Orthodox churches and include the Armenians, Ethiopians, Copts and Syrians, which are today increasingly present in public awareness because of their broader distribution in the Western world, but above all because of the conflicted developments in the Arab world. Because these schisms revolved around the confession of Christ and thus the core of the Christian faith, it is easy to grasp that in ecumenical dialogues with the Oriental Orthodox churches, Christological questions were in the forefront of the topics to be discussed. These dialogues have led to the pleasing result that both ecclesial communities are grounded in the common universal Christian confession, both of the humanity of God in Jesus, and that the Son is the same substance as the Father, although these beliefs are given expression in different theological terminology. In 1971, this acknowledgement led to a joint declaration between Pope Paul VI and the Syrian Orthodox Patriarch Mar Ignatius Jakub III, in which this fundamental Christological consensus was infamously affirmed. On the basis, in 1984, John Paul II and Patriarch Ignatius Zacharias I signed a pastoral accord regarding the administration of the sacraments to the faithful of the ordered church in specific situations. This accord deserves to be considered historic because with it, for the first time in history, a limited communicatio in sacris was agreed upon despite continuing the ecclesial division. That did not, however, in any way enable Eucharistic communion in the full sense. In order to take further steps in this direction, ecclesiological questions today are at the forefront of ecumenical conversations, more precisely, the topics of the Church as communio and the communicatio of the churches between one another in the first 500 years of church history. These pleasing developments have become possible also because in both ecclesial communities, the fundamental ecclesiological structure formed in the 2nd century and designated as the Successio Apostolica has been maintained, namely the sacramental, fundamental, Eucharistic and episcopal structure of the Church. An analogous acknowledgement can also be made in view of the schism between the Eastern and the Western Church, insofar as there is between both churches a fundamental commonality in faith, in the sacraments, and the episcopal constitution of the Church. The ecumenical dialogues with the Orthodox churches have therefore been able to concentrate in the first instance on the consolidation of the shared foundation of the faith. That is particularly true of the first decade, 1980 to 1990, in which extensive convergence was established between Orthodox and Roman Catholic theology regarding the subjects of the sacraments, the mystery of the Church, and especially the Eucharist, the relationship of faith, sacraments, and Church, and of the sacrament of priestly office. In contrast, in the second decade, 1990 to 2000, the theological dialogue focused with increasing intensity on the crucial problem of proselytism and uniatism, which eventually led to the cessation of the work of the International Mixed Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church in the year 2000. It is one of the great ecumenical achievements of Pope Benedict XVI that the International Mixed Commission for Theological Dialogue between the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox Church was able to take up its work again shortly after the beginning of his pontificate. Since then, it has been concentrating on that difficult point in the understanding of the Church, which has until now hindered the adoption of ecclesial and Eucharistic communion, namely the question of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. The foundational document of Ravenna of 2007 on ecclesial and canonical consequences of the sacramental nature of the Church brought a promising step forward in that both churches declared that the Church at the local, regional and universal level has need of a protos first. This step is of course overshadowed by the fact that it is not shared by the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate, because it does not consider any primacy at all possible at the universal level. On the theological foundation of the Ravenna document, it was intended that in the next step, the historical question is to be examined of what role the Bishop of Rome played in the first common millennium of East and West. This historical question, too, has folded in the meantime and is to be progressed by way of a theological discussion on the relationship of primacy and synodality in the Church. The auspices for this dialogue are good, if that goal is aimed at which Pope Benedict XVI formulated already in the 60s, that Rome must not demand of the East more in the way of primacy doctrine that was formulated and lived in the first millennium. In his major interview with Peter Seewald, Pope Benedict XVI even dared to state that the Eastern churches were local churches, as though they have no connection with the Pope. And in this sense, unity with the Pope is not constitutive for the local church. On the other hand, however, this lack of unity represented an internal deficit within the local church, and to that extent the no communion with the Pope was a deficit in his life cell. In synthesis, the Pope formulated it too. It remains a cell, it can be called a church, but within the cell one point is missing, namely the link with the organism as a whole. Pope Benedict XVI too took the essential steps toward orthodoxy, and further dialogue must remain committed to this direction. In order to make headway on this difficult issue, on the one hand, the Catholic Church must deepen the understanding that the primacy of the Bishop of Rome is not purely external jurisdictional addendum to the Eucharistic ecclesiology, but intrinsically grounded in it, insofar as the worldwide network of Eucharistic communions also requires a ministry of unity at the universal level. The papal ministry can ultimately only be understood from the starting point of this worldwide Eucharistic network. It is an unending essential element of the Church because it stands in the service of the Eucharistic unity of the Church and bears the responsibility for the fact that the Church again and again takes in measure from the Eucharist. On the other hand, it is to be expected of the Orthodox churches that it decisively confront this core ecclesiological problem, namely the autocephaly principle of nation churches and its inherent nationalistic tendency. Here, however, we can assert with gratitude that Orthodox theologians like John Meyendorff also judge the conception of autocephalous national churches as a weakness within Orthodoxy, so that from side too a reconciliation between Eucharistic ecclesiology and the principle of the Petrine ministry may not be remote. Here it also becomes evident that the primacy issue conceals a more profound ecclesiological problem, namely that within Catholic Orthodox dialogue, two diverse global understanding of the Church as communio have until now confronted one another unreconciled, namely the Orthodox understanding of the Church bound the national culture and the Catholic understanding of the Church cast in a universal mode, and that this problem finds its most intense expression in the question of the primacy of the Bishop of Rome. The progress of ecumenical dialogue with the Eastern churches will also have important ramifications for the dialogue with the churches and ecclesial communities that emerged from the Reformation, and thus for overcoming the division of the Western Church since the 16th century. In regard to this split since the Reformation, we are today confronted by a great number of churches and ecclesial communities which demonstrate only marginal efforts towards greater unity among one another. Within world Protestantism, we instead observe increasing fragmentations, which can be identified as the immediate consequences of both a relatively loose understanding of ecclesial unity and of the great growth of new evangelical and charismatic groupings. Ecumenical dialogue with the churches and ecclesial communities of the Reformation is confronted by the additional difficulty that the split in the Western Church produced an altogether new type of being the Church, differing essentially from the fundamental ecclesiological structure of the ancient Church. In these ecclesial communities, the Roman Catholic Church naturally recognizes essential elements of the being of the Church, above all, the proclamation of the Word and baptism. But at the same time, it has to recognize that as distinct from the great tradition of antiquity, according to which Church in the true sense exists, wherever the episcopal ministry in the sacramental succession of the apostles is present, and with it the Eucharist as presided over by the bishop and the priest in the ecclesial communities that emerged from the Reformation, another type and a new understanding of the Church has emerged. This fact has as consequence that the ecumenical dialogue with these churches and ecclesial communities cannot simply concentrate on differences in individual doctrines or ecclesiological elements, such as the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, but must come to terms with another type of fundamental ecclesial structure and another type of church. With the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification agreed upon between the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity on 31 October 1999 in Augsburg, it was indeed possible to achieve a broad degree of consensus on one of the general questions leading to the 16th century Reformation. To that extent, it represents a milestone in the ecumenical encounter between Lutheranism and the Catholic Church. But as the formula of a differentiated consensus in the fundamental proof of the doctrine of justification used at the time itself expresses, that does not mean that the full consensus has been reached on the doctrine of justification itself, let alone on the consequences of this doctrine, above all for the understanding of the Church and the question of ministry. This means, however, that the remaining questions are consolidated in the more precise understanding of what the Church is, and that therefore the theological clarification of the understanding of the Church must in future form part of the agenda to be dealt with in ecumenical dialogue between Lutherans and Catholics. This clarification could and should ultimately find a resolution in the drafting of a prospective declaration, analogous to the joint declaration on the doctrine of justification on Church, Eucharist and ministry. Without doubt, such a declaration would represent a decisive step forward on the way to a visible church communion, which is the goal of all ecumenical endeavors in the dialogue with the ecclesial communities of the Reformation. Such perspectives also spring from the historical affirmation that the crucial intention of the Reformation as a whole, and of Martin Luther in particular, lay in a radical reform of the whole Church, and indeed not in the Reformation, in the sense of the ultimately shattered unity of the Church and the establishment of new Reformed churches. If Luther was intent upon a comprehensive renewal of the whole Church, and not the foundation of new churches, one must deduce from the historical fact that Luther's true intention at the time were not able to be fulfilled, not only the failure of the Roman Church of the time, but also the lack of success of the Reformation itself, as the Protestant ecumenist Wolfgang Pannenberg has rightly repeatedly reminded us. In his view, nothing was further from its purposes than the separation of particular evangelical churches from the one Catholic Church. The development of a specific Protestant church polity was an emergency solution, since the original goal of the Reformation was the reform of the Church as a whole. We view from the opposite perspective. This insight means that one can only expect the success of the Reformation when the inherited splits have been overcome in a renewed Church of all Christians, and consequently that ecumenical efforts towards regaining unity involved the fulfillment and the work of the Reformation itself. With this insight, the concept of a joint commemoration of the Reformation in the year 2017, to which the Lutherans have invited the Catholic Church, becomes feasible. The Lutheran Roman Catholic Commission for Unity has accordingly responded to this invitation with the drafting of the new document, From Conflict to Communion, which was recently presented to the public and contains three significant emphases, namely, in the first instance, gratitude and joy at the current mutual rapprochement in life and faith, which has become possible in the past 50 years of ecumenical dialogue. Secondly, the hope that the joint commemoration of the Reformation will grant us the possibility of taking further steps toward the hope for full unity. But thirdly, also retreat and penitence for the misunderstandings, malice, and hurtfulness that Lutherans and Catholics have inflicted upon one another over the past 500 years. If we add to the necessary purification of the memory the shared reckoning of how we today evaluate the 1500 years that preceded the Reformation today in the light of this common history, we can with justification expect from a joint commemoration of the Reformation a courageous new impulse for the continued process of ecumenical rapprochement between the Catholic Church and the churches and ecclesial communities that emerged from the Reformation. With this presentation, short presentation of the two basic types of schism and the resulting residual ecumenical problems, we find ourselves in the midst of the ecumenical work of the present. At this point, it is however necessary to insert a flashback to the starting point of the ecumenical movement in the Catholic Church, namely the Second Vatican Council, which at the time awakened great hopes regarding ecumenism in particular, nurturing short-term expectation among many that the ecumenical unity of all Christians was imminent. After 50 years, we must, however, candidly admit that we have not yet achieved the goal of the ecumenical movement, namely full ecclesial unity. This realization is of course not a cause for resignation, because ecumenism, like life itself, does not, of course, run in a linear direction process. In this realistic view, we must confront those more recent developments within the ecumenical movement which have occurred over recent decades and have not in any way simplified the ecumenical dialogue. That's the second part of my conference. In the first instance, new partners have contributed towards an essential change in the ecumenical landscape. Today, ecumenical dialogues are not only conducted between the major historical churches of the West in particular. We encounter new partners above all in the so-called free churches, whose significance is constantly growing, not least because they have preempted the future that also clearly awaits the historical churches, namely the aim of the inherited Constantinian Christendom, that is freedom and independence from the state. Of particular significance here is the rapid increase of the Pentecostal communities, which represent the second largest Christian community after the Roman Catholic Church, and have profoundly altered the worldwide geography of Christianity. This involves such an expansive phenomenon that one can speak of a current Pentecostalization of Christianity and can be inclined to see them as a new basic form of being Christian. That is, beside Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox churches, the Catholic churches, and the ecclesial communities of the Reformation. Even if individual groupings occupy expressly anti-ecumenical positions and adopt an anti-Catholic attitude, we must seek dialogue with them. The new ecumenical challenge must be perceived first of all in the self-critical question as to the reasons why not a few Catholics transfer to these movements, without, of course, yielding to the temptation to adopt their sometimes problematic evangelization methods. As far as substance is concerned, dialogue will need to have an emphasis on the rule of pneumatology and the question of the charismatic dimension of faith and church life. Another, second, fundamental shift in the ecumenical landscape must be seen in the fact that in the past decades great divergences and massive tensions have appeared in the ethical sphere. They have become visible particularly controversially in the worldwide Anglican communion and have led it to the brink of a painful split, resulting in whole groupings together with their priests and bishops entering the Catholic Church. divergent answers, above all, of bioethical and social ethical questions on the one hand, and the problem of gender ethics on the other, can of course also be perceived in other Christian churches and ecclesial communities, and are in part dealt with them in a quite polarizing way. This development reveals a quite paradox phenomenon. While in the early stage of the ecumenical movement the slogan was "Faith divided, action unites," the opposite is virtually true today. While it has in part been possible over the past decades to overcome old denominational contradiction in belief, or at least to transform them into partial consensus, today great differences emerge in ethical questions. This change implies a great ecumenical challenge. If the Christian churches and ecclesial communities cannot speak with one voice on the great ethical questions of today's society, they not only weaken the social mission of Christianity, but also damage the credibility of the Christian ecumenism as a whole in today's society. When one begins to grapple with these new ethical controversies, one soon discovers that in most instances, behind the ethical problems, there are usually issues relating to the image of mankind. Therefore, a major task facing ecumenical dialogue today consists in the development of a Christian anthropology and a social ethic capable of gaining the ecumenical consensus. From there, our gaze is directed towards a further fundamental shift in the current ecumenical landscape, which can be diagnosed as the fact that in the course of the past decades, the goal of the ecumenical movement has constantly become less clear. That reveals that real paradox of the current ecumenical situation. In the previous phases of the ecumenical movement, on the one hand, wide-ranging and pleasing convergences and consensus have been achieved on many individual questions. All remaining points of difference, however, are, on the other hand, have consolidated around the quite divergent profiles of denominationally determined understandings of the ecumenical unity of the Church per se. That indeed involves a quite crucial problem, since of there is no shared goal in view. There is an imminent danger that the ecumenical partners stride ahead in different directions, only to discover later that they have distanced themselves from one another even more than they were before. The disputed nature of the ecumenical goal is today demonstrated concretely in the fact that many of the churches and ecclesial communities of the Reformation, above all, have steadily abandoned the original envisaged goal of visible unity in the shared faith, in the sacraments and in ecclesial ministries, in favor of a postulate of mutual recognition of the various ecclesial communities as churches and thus as part of the one Church of Jesus Christ. This postulation does not as such insist on a principal invisibility of the unity of the Church, but then the visible unity of the Church simply consists in the addition of all present church bodies. But it's not clear how this goal could accord with the biblical image of the one body of Christ. It is instead obvious that this view of an additive ecclesiological pluralism favored by contemporary Protestantism cannot be harmonized with the Catholic principle of ecumenism. The lack of a consensus within the current ecumenical situation on the goal of the ecumenical movement must be further and more deeply explored. One would then discover that this is grounded in the lack of a consensus of the nature of the Church. The fact that no really workable agreement has been achieved as yet regarding the goal of the ecumenical movement and that previous partial consensus in this regard has in part been called into question, has its essential basis in the fact that quite diverse denominational conception of the Church and its unity continually stand unreconciled beside one another, as they did at the outset. Since the different churches and ecclesial communities have individual confessional concepts of what the unity of their own church is, and since they obviously seek to transfer this concept also to the goal of the ecumenical movement, there are as many concepts of an ecumenical goal as there are confessional ecclesiologies. It is therefore not possible to derive an ecumenically compatible model for unity from one's own denominational understanding of the Church and its unity without encountering problems. An additional difficulty consists in the fact that the awareness of this elementary problem has not been strongly developed until the present day. In order to make progress on these crucial questions, it becomes clear that the theological clarification of the understanding of the Church and of unity must be the main point in future ecumenical agendas. These factors may be seen as the most important developments and the most crucial changes to have taken place in the ecumenical landscape in recent decades, prompting us to seek new perspectives in ecumenism. This task can only be credibly undertaken if we render account that ascetic changes are essentially motivated by the total cultural context in which we live today. The greatest challenge, without doubt, consists in the fact that the quest for unity is not highly valued in the contemporary mainstream. Or the all-pervading pluralist and relativist spirit of the age is virtually taken for granted on the basis of the assumption that we neither can or may turn our minds back to before the plurality of reality if we do not want to expose ourselves to the suspicion of a totalitarian mindset. Indeed, plurality is seen as the only way in which the whole can be apprehended, if at all. This fundamental abandonment of the idea of unity is characteristic of postmodernism, which is not only the acceptance and tolerance of plurality, but rather an option for pluralism on principle. Any search for unity, also and especially in ecumenism, therefore seems suspect from the start. Unity is therefore seen as the best and tolerant acknowledgement of plurality and diversity, in which reconciled diversity is already considered to have been realized. Christian ecumenism can only withstand this elementary challenge by not accommodating itself to this postmodern paradigm, but instead with charming stubbornness persists in keeping alive the question of unity even today. Without the quest for unity, the Christian faith would surrender itself. That unity is and remains a fundamental category of Christian faith is vouched for of all by the high priestly prayer of Jesus, in which he himself prays for the unity of his disciples. This prayer has a very special significance for the ecumenical task, since Jesus in this prayer looks beyond the community of disciples of that time and directs his gaze towards all future disciples, as he prays expressly not only for them, but also for those who will believe in he proves their word. Future church, as the communion of all those who believe in Christ on the basis of the words of the apostles, is thrown into Jesus' prayer, and therefore it too stands in the light of the unity for which Jesus has prayed. Through the high priestly prayer of Jesus, we can, as a consequence, best discern what is and must be profoundly at the heart of the ecumenical obligation in the light of faith. If the unity of his disciples is Jesus' central concern in his prayer, Christian ecumenism can only mean Christians joining in Jesus' prayer, in that they make his heart's desire their own. If the motivation of ecumenism is not simply philanthropic or humanitarian, but Christological, it can ultimately be nothing less than participation in the high priestly prayer of Jesus. In the prayer of Jesus, that Almighty One, we are struck first of all by the fact that Jesus did not command unity to the disciples or demand he taught them, but prays for it. This insight was profound significance for our ecumenical responsibility even today. The prayer for the unity of Christians is and remains the defining keynote of all ecumenical efforts. The spiritual orientation point found its tangible expression from the outset in the fact that the week of prayer for the unity of Christians stood at the beginning of the ecumenical movement and was an ecumenical initiative. We need to constantly bear in mind that it was the prayer for unity that opened the way for the ecumenical movement. But it is not simply a matter of the beginning from which we can never leave behind. It is rather a beginning that we take with us on our way and accompanies all ecumenical efforts still today. There can be no true ecumenism that is not rooted in prayer. With this prayer for unity, we Christians give expression to our faith conviction that we cannot create unity nor of ourselves determine its form or its time frame, but only allow it to be granted to us. The prayer for unity reminds us that even in ecumenities not everything is achievable, but that we Christians must leave room from the working of the Holy Spirit, which is not at our disposal, and place our trust in Him at least as much in our own efforts. Christian ecumenism can only be conducted in the presence of the Spirit. The ecumenical endeavor for Christian unity is above all a spiritual task. And spiritual ecumenism is, as the Second Vatican Council expressed it the most possible, the soul of the entire ecumenical movement. In ecumenism, we can only make progress if we return to its spiritual roots and develop and demand a renewed spiritual ecumenism. Today too, credible ecumenism stands or falls by the depth of its spiritual power. Ecumenism can only expand if it is rooted in the spiritual depth and if their common faith in Christ is the shared root of all the Baptists from which they draw their life. Faith in Christ is the all-encompassing foundation of ecumenical unity. In the depth of this unifying faith, we already find ourselves in the sphere of ecumenism, where we have been sent together to bear witness to the Christian faith in the world of today. That illuminates the goal of ecumenical responsibility and at the same time the true orientation of Jesus' high priestly prayer, in which he prayed for the unity of his disciples, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them even as you loved me. This final clause gives unmistakable expression to the fact that unity among Jesus' disciples is not an end in itself, but serves the credibility of the mission of Jesus Christ and his church in the world. This finality of the ecumenical quest for unity was recognized already 100 years ago at the first World Mission Conference in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1910. This conference was faced with the scandal that the various Christian denominations were cooperating in their mission work to the detriment of credible evangelization, above all on distant continents, as they imported European church divisions into foreign cultures together with the gospel. Since an authentic witness to the work of salvation of Jesus Christ in the world is only possible when the churches overcome their divisions in the doctrine of faith and in life, in Edinburgh, the Anglican mission bishop Charles Brent, above all, postulated intensive efforts to overcome those differences in doctrine and in church order which stand as obstacles in the way of unity. With this fundamental understanding that the division within Christendom formed the most difficult obstacle for world mission, evangelization has steadily become a more significant issue on ecumenical agendas. Since Edinburgh, ecumenical concern and missionary engagement have therefore been seen in unison, and mission and ecumenism have been presented as twin sisters, mutually challenging and fostering one another. It is therefore to be valued as a beautiful coincidence that in the anniversary year of the century of the Edinburgh World Mission Conference, Pope Benedict XVI established the Pontifical Council for promoting new evangelization, in the conviction that all churches living in traditionally Christian territories urgently need a renewed missionary impulse as the expression of a new generous openness to the gift of Christ. The starting point of every evangelization is not a human plan for expansion, but on the contrary, the desire to share the inestimable gift that God has wished to give us, making us sharers in His own life. The heart of the new evangelization therefore consists in leading people to the divine mystery and introducing them to a personal relationship with God, in the conviction that if we do not give a person God, we are not giving Him enough. The focus of all new evangelization must therefore be the God question, which is necessarily our ecumenical responsibility. Pope Benedict sees this as the most urgent ecumenical concern, as he clearly formulated it at an ecumenical encounter during a recent visit to Germany. The search for the infinite is ineradicably present in mankind. Mankind has been created towards God and needs Him. Our foremost ecumenical service in this age must be to bear common witness to the presence of the living God, and in so doing to give the world the answer that it needs. Still today more than even the ecumenical movement has to stand in the service of mission work and concretely of the new evangelization. In that context, we are forcibly reminded that the most credible witnesses of the faith are the martyrs, who have borne testimony of their faith with their life, even unto death. We have every reason to remember them in the world of today, where the Christian faith is the most persecuted of all religions. In that, to be more precise, 80% of all those who are persecuted for their faith are Christians. This fact represents a great challenge to Christian ecumenism to demonstrate sympathetic solidarity with an effective assistance to persecuted Christians throughout the world. At the end of the second and the beginning of the third millennium, Christendom has once more become a church of martyrs, and in fact, under the banner of ecumenism. Today, all churches and ecclesial communities have their martyrs, so that one can indeed speak of an ecumenism of martyrs. Amid of all this tragedy, it contains the beautiful promise In spite of all the dramas of church division, the steadfast witnesses to the faith in all Christian churches and communities have shown how in the face of the utmost claim of faith testified through the sacrifice of their lives, God Himself upholds the communion among the faithful at a more profound level. While we Christians and churches here on earth still stand in an imperfect communion towards and with one another, the martyrs in their heavenly glory already live a full and perfect communion. The martyrs are, therefore, as the blessed Pope John Paul II has impressively stressed, the proof that in the total self-giving of the self, the cause of the gospel, every element of division can be dealt with one overcome. In the ecumenism of the martyrs, the conviction of the early church is renewed once more that the blood of martyrs is the seed of the church. Today too, we as Christians may live in the hope that the blood of the ecumenical martyrs of our day will one day prove to be the seed of the full unity of all Christians. In this hope, we will and must continue on the path of ecumenism, encouraged by the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council, which claimed the restoration of Christian unity as one of its major concerns and set it on the path that is irreversible and we must therefore in future continue to follow. I thank you.